It's a great pleasure to be here. And again, a real audience, real people, wonderful colleagues I've known for many years from across Europe and other parts of the world. And to connect communities, you really do need to connect them in person. I'm also very impressed not only with the kinds of topics our colleagues have used to open, but to note that this is the rare conference that is bringing together people from the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. If we really are going to build research data infrastructures, we need to do it in such a way that we bridge these many communities and have people at the same table together. So that's what I want to talk about in terms of knowledge infrastructures and particularly how we connect communities and how, if we don't do this right, they can also disconnect communities because we have a lot of that over the years as well. You've very generously given us an hour for this session. I'd like to talk for, say, at most 45 minutes and allow 15 or 20 minutes, however much time we have, for discussion at the end. So please save them up, otherwise you won't get lunch. So, all right. So let me start with this, a few of the translations of this book, and again, other ways of thinking about some of these things. Oh. Did this not get back in there? Well, the clicker's not working. Okay, we'll do this. All right. So, why research data infrastructure? So just to start at the top, we have a number of assumptions here about research data infrastructure. We assume that the data themselves are valuable, that they're worth keeping, that people are going to use them, and that they will be reused by other people, and also that they should be fair. And we have a number of the principles, the authors, the original FAIR principles here in this room. So let me just lay those out to say those are assumptions, but they're not necessarily the way the world works. Okay, let's unpack those. They're aspirations, but they're not necessarily really what we're able to do now. Okay. This is a quick framing of some other work we've done. I'll scatter a couple of bibliographic references. I'll post the slides later. We will share them. Don't feel like you need to get the notes down. I've even got a little bit of a reference list at the end for you. This is work that Phil Bourne, another of the original authors of the FAIR principles, and I did coming out of the NIH, of really laying out all the different stakeholders who are involved. It's not just those of you here who are involved in building the infrastructure, but it's many people within the universities and the people that we would like to also use them. And bringing this village together of getting all these people to find common ground and common interest is what it's going to take to move forward. The second paper there by Amy Brand that came out in Science just this last year focuses on the difficulties that universities are having managing their own internal data as well as the sort of the research data, another side of some of the open data and making best use of data issues. So encourage you to look at some of those. Not working. Okay. So if you take nothing else away from this talk but this, I will be happy. Data exist in the eye of the beholder. Data are not stuff, they're not facts, they're not things, they're not artifacts. Something becomes data only when we begin to use it as evidence of some kind of phenomena. Here's a few examples. Particularly like the one of the Cassini space mission, which has lots of big numbers in it. But which of those numbers would you actually consider to be something you would call data? We see throughout our work, and I've worked in many different fields over these years, as Carol has mentioned, that one person's signal is someone else's noise. The astronomers we work with, you sit on the same team. One person is trying to look at the stars and subtract out the gas. Somebody else is looking at the gas and trying to subtract out the stars. The data that the climatologists have is not useful to the scientists in its present form, and vice versa. It's this ability to recognize the very malleability, the mobility, in more of a social science sense, of what research data are, what they can become, that makes it so difficult to build an infrastructure when we don't agree on what are those kind of stuff in the first place. So let's talk about infrastructure itself as a construct or as a concept. And this is part of what York and I had discussed for what a good framing would be to here to do, is in the social sciences, we're developing quite a bit of just infrastructure studies. It goes back a couple of decades now. The MIT Press has an entire book series on infrastructure that brings together people from different backgrounds. Now, the phrase that I'm using is knowledge infrastructures. This is the title used in my center. We've had a number of projects funded by the National Science Foundation and Sloan Foundation under this rubric. There's several groups in Europe that are using the frame of knowledge infrastructures as well. The term was first coined by our good colleague Paul Edwards in a brilliant book I also recommend to you highly on the history of climate models, why and how it took 100 years to collect enough weather data to be able to produce a climate model. And it's a great story to read in terms of thinking about research data infrastructure. It's really building the first big data infrastructure, and that's how long it took. So it's to note that there's people, there's artifacts, there's institutions, and we should be thinking not just about the technical infrastructures, but the practices, the policy frameworks, and the governance models. And I think I'll spend some time at the end getting us to think about how you govern this very messy set of pieces with many, many moving parts. This is a bit hard to read, but I'll talk you through it. Okay. The paper noted on the left by Lee Starr and Karen Ruleter from 1996 is considered the seminal paper in infrastructure studies of laying out 8 dimensions that characterize when something becomes an infrastructure. Then other colleagues on the right took the 8 and put it into this map to say, let's look at it along 2 different axes. And I just want to work through them briefly from the technical back around through the local and again. Notice on this first upper left quadrant that to be an infrastructure, it's the embodiment of standards. That's the whole interoperability. But the interoperability is going to vary from community to community. You move up farther, you've got transparency. If it's working well, you don't want to see it, it should be fine. The reach or scope should be pretty broad, but is linked with conventions of practice. And that's many of the conversations we've been having here already is the way that you would use a system. If you're a Mac user, if it's a PC, forget it. If you're a Python user and it's in Fortran, forget it. You know, people are going to use what they're comfortable with and what they've learned. Things become very quickly embedded in local practices and what they're willing to use. You learn them as part of your graduate programs, you learn them as part of your employment, you learn them as part of your university. Infrastructure most notably becomes visible upon breakdown. I mean, part of what we learned in the pandemic was how dependent we were on supply chains, on electrical grids. It wasn't until it didn't work that you realized that it was an infrastructure. And then lastly, how it's built on an installed base. No matter what you're building, you can't throw it out and start over. And I've seen this in astronomy, particularly. Astronomy has one of the richest, most complex, most effectively interacting infrastructures of any field out there. One reason being they agreed on a standard data structure in the late 1970s, the FITS formats. It's written in Fortran. Guess what? We're still writing code on top of that in Fortran because that's the installed base. You know, lots of it in Python, the more modern stuff is elsewhere, but you're not going to get away from that Fortran base, not anytime soon, because you're going to have to rebuild all the layers underneath to do that. So that's what infrastructure is all about. So the global and the technical, those are the things you can point at, that's what you can touch, that's what most of the people here are involved in building. And many of these go back a very long way. Even Galileo's telescope, those observations are part of today's modern databases because you want to be able to compare what's in the night sky now and what we saw in each century thereafter and each decade thereafter. It's a lot of accumulation of some of these kinds of knowledge. The social is the much more difficult part, and that's really where I want to spend most of the time today. Would that we could take that little shoulder full of data and walk it to a depository and drop it off. Okay. There's a reason that when you pass your data, whether it's to DONS or ICPSR or GASIS or wherever, it may take a year from the time you submit it to the time it actually appears, because of the amount of labor it takes to do the metadata, to do the data cleaning, to do the management. It's a very different kind of skill set, and it's a skill set that requires domain knowledge and technical knowledge and infrastructure knowledge to make it useful for the long term. Now, those data archives are not necessarily just digital archives. They can be photo archives. I've tried to balance some of the disciplines here. I've got a wonderful picture from the deep ocean drilling where we've got ice cores that are stored at -80. That's a data archive to come back to it. Okay? So there's many kinds, there's butterfly archives, you name it, lots of different archives. And preserving each kind requires different techniques. Okay? But the maintenance tends to be the most important and the least well-funded. There's also a big movement in a literature on maintenance and repair for anyone who wants to look there as an emerging area in the social sciences. So let's say, where are we now, and where do we want to go, and how are we going to get there? Okay. Where are we now? We've built many of the research infrastructure, particularly the technical infrastructure, and we've got more of the policy pieces in place now. We've got better computing capacity. Universities are building out servers. It's less of the server under the desk than it was. We've got the ERICs, data repositories. Although the data repositories still vary considerably from field to field if they exist and if they're funded. The policy has certainly moved greatly along in the last 2 decades. The scholarly practices we're beginning to understand better. A number of us have been working in the field for a couple of decades now. OpenX is publishing, but these all need a lot of work. We're far from seamless. Okay. We have methods to share data, and this is, sort of a very simple high level is what do? You deposit the data archive, but that assumes you have a data archive that will take your kind of data. We ran into very interesting challenges where you've got different kinds of data, mixed ones. A brief example from the data archiving classes that I've taught at UCLA, where you would do student projects. An environmental scientist was working with taxi drivers in Los Angeles to understand the effect of air pollution on their day-to-day work. They put instruments in the taxis, had them drive a regular sequence. They also took blood samples, air samples, and such of the taxi drivers. They had no place to put the data because anybody who wanted the instrument environmental data was not certified to take biomedical data, and anyone taking biomedical data had no interest in the engineering data. You will find examples like this all over the place, and no good way to link them from the environmental database to the biomedical, but unless you look at them as a whole, they're not going to be all that useful for the long term. You'd want to publish the data documentation, the protocols, the code books, the software, the algorithms, link them, cite the data and software. It looks simple, but it can take as much time and labor to do everything on this slide as it did to do the research in the first place. So that's the steps really between doing the research and getting to the fair data is all of these things, different people, different players, and we could have a long conversation about the data citation issues, but we'll save that for another talk, okay? Or lunch or dinner or whatever, okay? We've also come a long way on the data sharing policies and getting more explicit, and this is what Carol mentioned earlier that you're both part of, is the National Institutes of Health set forth its first major data sharing policy effective January of 2003. It was one of the first. Wellcome Trust in Britain preceded it. And then 20 years on, they've got a much more aggressive plan that came into effect this year To do that, they commissioned the National Academy of Sciences to do a 2-day workshop just to look at the implementation. That's what we were. We were part of it, and that's what Phil Bohr and I wrote the paper from, that 2-day workshop. Notice that it lays out what they mean by scientific data, data management, data sharing, metadata, and what the plan should look like. But let me call out this piece. Okay, this is one of the most succinct and clear definitions you will find in a data sharing set of requirements. And yet, notice what it says here. It says that the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community. Every person in this room has a different idea of what is commonly accepted practice. Okay. So even for as long fought as this was, they can't get beyond commonly accepted, and the notion of what is a fact has about a 500-year history in the scientific literature of just when something becomes a fact. So factual material is itself a bit of a challenge. Okay. So how do we get here? Again, a few examples, things to kind of work through and think about. This is the Center for Embedded Network Sensing, and I was one of the founding co-investigators, so my students and I were deeply embedded in this group. This was very early days building new sensor networks, more than 300 people from more than 5 universities, UCLA, University of Southern California, Caltech, others. And somewhere between $50 and $100 million went into this center over the course of 10 years. The scientists wanted to be part of it because they wanted new technologies to collect their data. The computer scientists and engineers wanted to be part of it because they wanted real-world problems. So you really brought these communities together. And for me as a socio-technical researcher, it was a great opportunity. And these are just a few of the kinds of sensors that were being used in the system. Now, we interviewed people in many different parts of it. This is an example of the first 2 or 3 years of SENS went to getting stable technologies. Okay, they would crash, they would reboot, the timestamps wouldn't work, you couldn't coordinate anything. The information theorists were going nuts on this, the environmental scientists. People were dipping water samples out and centrifuging them with a string to compare it to what was coming out of the water, all kinds of stuff going on. But once they got something stable, they got a temperature that was same on sensor from one day to the next, they said, I got it. Temperature is temperature. I've got something I could publish in an engineering journal. I'm happy. Biologist on the same team says, I cannot publish that in my journal. It's not calibrated. It does not match my standards. This biologist took that experimental sensor, set it next to 2 calibrated sensors for 365 consecutive days before he could trust the sensor, okay? Before he had something he could publish in his journals, okay? And we've witnessed many, many conversations like this. This is one example. We could give dozens, if not hundreds, of different fields where people are working side by side, but they have very different assumptions. And actually, at the end of a 2-week field trip with SENS, they would go home and take their data in all different directions, and ne'er the twain shall meet again. Okay, they published in different journals. They did different things with data they got. Here's a completely different example, and this is one of the case studies from the Big Data, Little Data, No Data book. Stefano Zacchetti, we very sadly lost during the pandemic, brilliant scholar who studied 3rd to 5th century Chinese Buddhist manuscripts, looking at how the knowledge moved across borders and across languages and across scripts. And this material is beginning to be digitized, so I was working with him to look at how his research practices and how his data, once we finally got to where, yes, he really had data. He didn't think he had data, but he had a lot of data. And see how, this beautiful box, it's got these very carefully calibrated metadata records, but then there's also high-quality facsimiles. If you could see, it's a bit of fine print. There's a lot of very detailed metadata. The community here has built an infrastructure to match 3rd to 5th century scripts in different languages against physical forms, printed volumes, digital forms, microfilm, bring the whole thing together. So they've managed to do some of this, but it really is in the eye of the beholder. This is one of my favorite ones from Stefano, is this brick from the Ashmolean was literally a brick in someone's home in about the 5th century, and today it's data. Okay. It's something, and someone else will look at the physical objects and so on and take them apart. But many things can become data in many different ways. So given that, what challenges do we face now? And this is just a few of them. We can't, hopefully over 3 days, we'll tackle some of these. We can't keep all the data. What state do you keep? The astronomy data goes through all of these different levels of refinement all the way down. How do you make them useful and reusable? The costs, the benefits, the incentives, the risks, the stewardship, the governance. And it's nice to have funders in the room as well to think that this is expensive and not easy to do. Okay. We really don't have as many incentives to share data as many of us would tend to assume. Okay. Remember how much money I said was spent on SENS, $50 to $100 million? There's no data left of that to speak of. Nothing. My team did everything we could to get them to save the data. They weren't required to keep it. And every team took it, and it went off in different directions. There's posters, there's papers. We built the depository within the University of California Scholarship, so that's the record, is the papers. But the data themselves, from that much money, that many years, that many people, no record. It's gone. Okay, it's all scattered in different ways because of many, many different things. And the expertise, the staff, the confidentiality, the risks, misappropriation, again, that's something we could spend a lot of time on. This is a little messy, but I think it's worth a brief talk through. This is from a paper that we put in the Harvard Data Science Review last year, the year before. The outside two arrows are from a paper by Karen Baker and Matthew Mayernick, and then we build out the inside part. So the bottom part is what scholars do, okay? Scholars work, you get a PhD, you get a DPhil, whatever, to be able to collect your data, do your research, refine it, and get a journal article. The knowledge production, that's what you're here for. That's the end of the day. That's what they care about. The top part, that's what the data repositories do. That's what data archivists do. That's a whole different path. That data packaging to make it useful for someone else is very split. It goes off in different directions. And not much investment is yet being made at that top piece. The middle piece, which is what Morgan Wofford and I really pulled out after working with the astronomers for a very long time, is there's a whole lot of recycling in between going on. And I'm part of the Galactic Center group based at UCLA, but it's international. And this is the one that shared the Nobel Prize with Rainer Genzel of the Max Planck, Andre Ghez from UCLA, and Genzel were two of the three winners in 2020 for physics for this work of being able to identify the black hole in the center of the Milky Way. So they've got now 28 years worth of data. And they're going back to those early data. But think about data they started taking in 1995 on very crude speckle instruments, then became eventually adaptive optics, became many other things. The number of students, the number of postdocs have been through these teams in 28 years. And they still need to come back and say, did we see that object 10 years ago? Where is that orbit? And unless they can track that orbit, it's tracking the orbit is how they're testing general relativity. But it's all that cycling in between, and there's all kinds of code that's been written down that green line. That's their secret sauce. They don't share that. They don't share that code. That code is not going in a public repository anywhere, anyhow. Okay. So there's a lot of cycling going on there that is really unacknowledged, and that's part of the way the data production and the knowledge production and reuse are working. This is also a different paper that we did in HDSR a bit earlier, And we combined work in biomedical that Irene Pesqueto did for her doctoral dissertation with me. And Carl Kesselman was part of this too, another collaborator, with the work that we did in SENS, because we're seeing very different things, actually very similar things across very different projects, which is when people did reuse data, it tended to be for what they call ground truthing. They would get open data from many different places, and they would use it to calibrate, they would use it to compare. They said, am I in the right, general framework for where I want to be? And that's a very frequent routine practice. When people want to take somebody else's data and start a new project, do a new analysis, combine things separately, what Irena found famously was the piece of metadata they most needed was the phone number of the principal investigator. Okay. And that is never in the record. And when they did reuse the data, they almost always formed a new collaboration. And the people who provided the data became co-authors on new collaboration, because that's what it took to reuse it. So we found, so the paper is called The Data Creator's Advantage, that no matter how well you add the software, the code, the documentation, the people who built this, collected the data in the first place, and that's why we spent a lot of time interviewing the graduate students and the postdocs, because they're the ones with their hands in the dirt to see how the data are made. They're always going to be the ones that know the data best. Okay. Nowadays, that's also a software creator's advantage too. As I mentioned before, that secret sauce of that code that they're using is what allows them to use things. So it's going to be very hard to get back to a lot of these. Very often, if you don't have the code, you don't have the data. And if you don't have the code of just the right version that runs on just the right operating system and on down the line, you really don't have it. I couldn't find a good picture of a pipeline because it's a fairly abstract concept. So let me just give you like a 1 or 2 minute on this, and you can read it closely. So the Keck telescopes, this is what our team gets most of their data from, the big twin telescopes, 100-meter telescopes in Hawaii. This was their new data reproduction pipeline. So it comes off in FITS files, and then it gets processed, cleaned for artifacts, looks at the night sky, what the viewing conditions are, the humidity, so on and so forth. And it comes down to something that's a usable data product, and then it becomes a data cube. Okay. So the telescope part does that. Once Andrea Ghez's team gets it, then they massage it for another year. Okay. With all the local stuff afterwards. So the data that you could get publicly would be coming out of this pipeline, but then there's all these different states of pipelines that come down afterwards. Okay? So deciding what state of data to keep is a non-trivial matter. Ideally, we would have this virtuous circle where you do your research, you document it, it goes into the system, it's reused by everybody else, it gets accumulated. Wouldn't that be lovely? Doesn't happen very often. This is the reality. Everybody's got legacy data. Everybody's got, I've got pictures in Andrea Ghez's office of the first cassettes. In fact, the Nobel Museum wanted to know, we need an artifact. And I said, Andrea, give them the first cassette. And she decided not the first cassette, but she gave them the first data sheet from 1995 that says, oh my God, written across the top of it to say, it's there, we found it. But it's that early data piece, that's what she gave the Nobel Museum out of it. But really, it's the graduate students, the postdocs, they're the ones that are doing most of the data collection, they're doing most of the software code. They are the most transient population we have. Is that really who you want to sustain the infrastructure? And this is where the investments really, really need to be made, is to get career paths, to get cohorts of the data sciences, the data librarians, the data archivists. And Kirsten and I had this conversation earlier, is, if UCLA, if KIT could have 20, 25 career staff where you get a new grant, say, I want a half of a person for a year, I'll pay for them on my grant, but they have a path to keep up, and then they continue to bring that through the university. We've been needing that for several decades now. We're beginning to invest in, say, a pool of research programmers. We need the research data archivists. This is what Andrea needs. This is what everybody else needs, coming in and really being able to do this. Wouldn't it be nice if we could plug that Ethernet into the cloud, into the European Open Science Cloud? Better yet, okay, be able to plug it in. But this "I'll get the hammer" is another one that I rather love, of what it takes to get those pieces in. So where do we go from here? First of all, we recognize the fragility. This is a famous XKCD cartoon, but this is really true. I mean, how many layers do you want to go down under Microsoft or Unix operating systems before there's some guy in Nebraska who really is running some piece of code on which everything else, it's a house of cards. And we need to realize there is a house of cards. We need to invest much more in the people and the processes. It's brittle. You change the installed base, things collapse. The human resources, you've got the skill sets, differences in communities, and people move from one university to the next. They finish their doctorate at one place, they go somewhere else, they take their data with them, they try to get it working there. We're beginning to be much more aware of the cyber attacks. UCLA gets attacked by the nanosecond. University of Michigan shut down the first week of fall term last month because of a cyber attack. They had to isolate the university from the internet. The entire University of Michigan isolated from the internet, okay, because of cyber attacks. Okay. Misuse, misappropriation. One of my, actually Morgan Wofford, who was a master's student with me, is now a doctoral student at Michigan, is writing about how so the eco-terrorists are taking data from public climate models and trying to use them for different things. Okay, you've got different communities misappropriating, as we would think, in other ways, which is also a reason people are sometimes reluctant to share their data, so they don't have to spend their time dealing with some of these people. And then there's all kinds of proprietary. In fact, a paper that we just submitted to Nature Astronomy, we're trying to dig out some of the important records and evaluations of a big NASA DFG project, and we couldn't find them publicly. One of my collaborators found them. It's written all over it. This evaluation cannot be shared because it contains proprietary patentable information. You can't even see that stuff. Okay. So a lot of other layers going on. Some of that's in the paper that Phil Bourne and I wrote that I mentioned earlier. Durability is what we're going for, but durability is an accomplishment. It's not an assumption. Fragility is the standard state. Where we want to go is working toward durability. And so again, bring people together, think about collaboration and openness, about the coordination, and units of measurement and so on. These are things that we're trying to get to. So back here, I've mentioned this already, but again, I think it's worth, again, a major takeaway point I'd like you to have is investing in that orange piece up there and recognizing there's a whole lot of cycling that's going on in this green part in the middle as well, okay? And that's part of science. It's part of people, working through and building long-term. You can't say nothing can be proprietary because people simply won't do the science. It will still happen. But for data protection for others, we're going to have to invest in the human infrastructure of data infrastructure to make this work, okay? So this is, back to the paper that Phil and I wrote, is building the village, and Carol's been our best publicity chair for this particular paper of getting things out there, that data sharing is a collective action problem. For those of you with any background in economics, you know about things like free riders. And that's part of what happens here. People can get things from the system and not contribute to the system. The benefits and the costs are unequally distributed. So we need much more holistic approaches, ways to distribute the responsibility. We've got a lot of kind of passing the buck in American slang would be, it's always the principal investigator's problem, as opposed to being the university's problem, the funding agency's problem, the library's problem. How do you bring these things together and reframe the goals in collective terms? And certainly even in our opening talks from the half dozen of you, you've been talking more about the collective action. But it's funding the commons, and even the big repositories, most of those are grant funded. So if the repository is the bottom layer, and that's on a 5-year grant, periodically we lose the entire database. Okay. And again, Phil and I talked about that a bit, because he's been tracking new data archives and disappearing data archives as well. So we need to invest much more in sustainable strategies. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of closing thoughts. One is to think about whose data we're talking about. We want it global and comparative and fungible, but local, integrative, and specific as well. Whose infrastructure? The individual investigators are investing a lot in their own infrastructures, but then we have these layers and layers of other infrastructures. And whose stewardship? I mean, who's going to maintain all these collections, the models? We haven't even talked about the implicit models underneath the data, the instruments, the code, and how we're going to invest in the people and the skills and in the collaborations. The late, great Jim Gray, Turing Award for having built the databases and digital libraries that underlie a lot of modern commerce, underlie the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, the Terra server, and so on. His closing remarks, until he was sadly lost at sea in 2007, was usually, "May all your problems be technical." Those are the easier ones to solve. It's the human problems that are the much harder ones to solve. Just a way of thank you. Even in Zoom land, I did a couple of practice talks across different disciplines to get some feedback from my community. And there's your bibliography, okay, as well.